Hello, Zalalam from 2620 is active. Today we will discuss about methods in Java in detail. Before that, if you are new to my channel, please subscribe, and if you like my videos, share, comment and like. Methods in Java are very important parts of the language construct, and always methods are constructed or used in a class. They cannot be used without a class, in contrast to many other programming languages where you can use methods without a class. So methods in Java generally are formatted as these terms in angle brackets are optional terms based on your need when you define your methods. So the access modifiers are modifiers which enable or prohibit or disable accessing the method outside the class when we are using the class instances. The other one is the final keyword. This has meaning in methods different from variables. When we say final in variables, that means we are saying that this is constant and it cannot be changed. The meaning in methods is different. We will discuss it in detail in inheritance, but it means that it cannot be inherited or used by any class which extends from the class that contains this method. The other keyword is static, and you might have seen the method main in our exercises before, that it's a static method. A static method is a method where it can be initialized without initializing any instance. That means it is available for the class even before it is instantiated, and it is called without any class instances. So the type is a required one during defining while defining methods. It's a required component, and the type in methods, we will see what we can address with methods. Then we write the method name. The recommendation in Java is based on conventions. The first letter of the method name to be small. Then after that, if we use multiple words in defining methods, the first letter of every word after the first word will be capital. You can make it small, you can make it capital, you can make it whatever you like, but that's a convention. It doesn't complain if you make it small or capital. Or so in parentheses we have got parameters. So parameters are optional. You can have parameters, or if you don't need them, you might not have parameters. Then the implementation will be included in between curly braces. So we'll discuss every component and other concepts in Java methods. So when we say access modifiers, as we have discussed, these are modifiers which enable or disable the access to the method outside the class after its instantiation. So we use the keyword private. The word indicates private means the method is private to the class, and it can be used or manipulated within the class definition. But if we have to access this method outside the class after instantiation, we have to access it indirectly. That means using other accessible methods, okay, using the keyword public. Okay, when we say public, the method defined as public in a class is accessible by a class outside the class definition after their instantiation for operating on data outside after initialization. So we have to know what we want to do with the access modifiers when we select access modifiers. The third one is the protected access modifier. This is very important access modifier, particularly in relation with Java inheritance. We will discuss it in detail when we discuss inheritance. So when we say final, means that the method cannot be inherited by a class inheriting from the class which contains the method, but it has a different meaning while the keyword final is used with variables. And when we say static, this keyword indicates that the method is accessible or can be accessed without class initialization, and it can be used variables too. Okay, so if you use it with a variable, that means it helps the variable to be accessed, used, or manipulated even without class initialization or object creation or instance creation from the class. And the commonest practice is to have a static block in the class definition for initialization of static variables. We will see that one in our exercises. The peculiar behavior of static methods is that they can only access static members. Okay, non-static members cannot be accessed in a static method. If we use static methods for a particular implementation, we have to make sure that the variables or other methods that we access in this method need to be static. And static methods cannot refer to the this keyword. You might remember from our class discussion and class creation exercise that this keyword refers to the current instance of the class initialized by declaration. So as we have said, static methods can be used and manipulated even before an object is initialized. That means they are accessed by any class using the class definition name. We don't have to have a variable to access static methods, so that's why we don't use this keyword. And we also do not use the super keyword. We will discuss it in inheritance. It means this keyword means that the inheriting class is applying or implementing the constructor definitions, implementations of the inherited class in this constructor, or initializing the implementation of the inherited class in a method. We'll discuss that in the inheritance lecture and exercises. So parameters. So as we have said, a method can have parameters or it can be without parameters. But when we define parameters, we have to have its type and identifier or variable name declared clearly. And if we have multiple parameters, they have to be separated by a comma, and there is a particular multivariable parameter definition in Java methods, or variable, or varargs. Sometimes they are called varargs, variable length parameter, and this is defined with the three dots operation. So this one indicates that nums is parameter with multiple values. Like this, this means that the parameter is an array called nums, and it can have different lengths as we like to use. Okay, so if we call add numbers method at different places, we can have no argument at all. When we call this method, we can have one argument, two arguments, 10 arguments as we like. Okay, so this gives you the flexibility of using various number of variables in the method call. And the types, these are required definition in the method definition, and there can be primitive types. Okay, that means integers, doubles, floats, boolean types, or they can be objects. That means objects used in the Java library, or objects that we have defined for our purpose. That means classes that we have defined for our purpose can be return types, and the return type can be void, which means the method is not expected to return anything. That means it returns no value when it's called. And when we call methods, we pass arguments by value or reference. And when we say by value, that means value of the argument is copied, but the value of the original variable will not be changed. Okay, so when we use primitive parameters and when we pass them as arguments when we call the method, by the way, when we say passing arguments, that means putting parameter values while we call the method during its implementation. Okay, we use parameters when we define the method, and we use arguments when we call the method. So when we say by reference, that means the argument refers to the parameter, and when you manipulate the value of the argument, it manipulates the value of the parameter. So this means when we put a reference argument, that reference argument value is copied from the parameter, and even though it's copied like the primitive types, since the value of that argument refers to the object or the instance it's supposed to act on, that reference will change the value of the parameter. So we will also have to pass variable arguments if we have defined var args parameters. That means the ones that we have used with 3 dots. When you have variable length arguments, we can call it without a parameter, we can call it with 1, 2, or whatever. So when, as we have defined add numbers in the previous discussion, we had the parameter nums. So we can make the parameter nums nothing, as the length of an array can be 0, and we can make it 2, we can make it 4, depending on our need when we call it. So that is a very flexible way of having methods in Java when we want different arguments at different implementations. The other important concept in Java methods is overloading. That means declaring methods with the same name in a class, but they will differ by their parameter type or number. So that is a signature to differentiate between two methods with the same name in a class. So if they have got different type parameters, that means if one method has got a type int and the other has got a type double, then they are treated as different methods, and the compiler identifies the specific type when we call it based on the argument provided. Okay, and if you have different number of arguments as well, this differentiates methods. So this is very important in implementing polymorphism in Java. And as we have discussed, when we call the method, the appropriate method is selected based on the type of the argument that we have passed or the number of arguments that we have passed, depending on the definition of the method in the class. And you have to be clear that changing the return type that we have discussed, the primitive, object, or void, changing the return type doesn't play a role in overloading or in selecting the correct version of the overloaded method when we call the method. So the important ones are the type of the parameter and the number of parameters. That's important in overloading. And constructors can also be overloaded, and it follows similar process as methods. So we can have a constructor with no parameters, we can have a constructor with one parameter or multiple parameters. So we can define multiple constructors and use specific ones as we desire when we concatenate the class. One of the important computer science concepts is recursion, and recursion is implemented in Java methods as well, and this is defining a problem in smaller forms of its behavioral characteristics or the problem characteristic. Okay, so if we are asked to add numbers up to 100, we use the principle that we add each number at a time. So we can use the recursion by using additions at each step. That means adding 100 values is one big problem, and then we use adding one value at a time. So we will reach to 100 values with recursion. Okay, so usually when we define the method, we use the method name or definition within that method to call itself. So that implements recursion, and there is a need to be careful when implementing recursions, that it has to have a condition to halt the recursion or stop the recursion. Otherwise, the running time will be indefinite and your computer might run out of memory and crash. So, like we have discussed in loops, they have to have a condition to stop loops, and in similar way, the recursion should have a condition to stop it, or a case where the recursion will stop. Okay, the other important concept in Java methods is local variable type inference, which is added in recent versions of Java. That means we define a variable using the keyword var, and the initialization should be done on the same line, okay, when we define the variable, and the type of the identifier will be defined when we initialize the variable, and the statement will infer the type of the variable from its definition. And once we have an inferred type of the variable, we cannot change the type of the variable. In other languages like JavaScript, if we define a variable with var keyword and make it a string, then we can redefine it to be a number. It's not a good practice, but we can do that. But in Java, it's not possible to do that one. Once the type is inferred during initialization, we cannot change the type of that variable definition. And when we use the var keyword, it is advised to use it very carefully and sparingly, as it might result in very subtle errors or bugs that could be hard to identify during compilation or running the program. So that's it for this video. Thank you for your time.